I was 28 years old when I realized my entire family had spent my whole life protecting me from asking one question, not answering it, not avoiding the answer, avoiding the question itself. The strange part is, I didn't even know what the question was. Looking back, the signs had always been there. When I was 10, my grandfather looked at me during Thanksgiving dinner and smiled. One of these days, he's finally going to ask. Before he could finish, my mother interrupted him so quickly it almost sounded rehearsed. "Dad, can you help me in the kitchen?" He looked at her. She looked back. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Grandpa slowly stood up without saying another word. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I remember something else. Nobody asked what he meant. Not my dad. Not my grandmother. Not my aunt. It was as if everyone at the table already knew exactly what sentence he had almost finished. I was 13 when it happened again. Grandma and I were looking through old photo albums. We laughed at terrible haircuts, ugly Christmas sweaters, and blurry vacation pictures. Then I turned the page. There was a gap. 4 photographs had been carefully removed. Not ripped, not damaged, removed. The empty photo corners were still attached to the page. "Who was here?" I asked. Grandma froze. She stared at the album for several seconds before quietly closing it. "Those pictures fell out years ago." I accepted the answer, until I realized something later that night. The photo corners were still glued to the page. Pictures don't just fall out of corners. Someone had taken them. When I was 16, my father and I were cleaning the garage. I found an old moving box filled with home videotapes. "Dad," I smiled. "We should watch these sometime." He looked inside the box. His smile disappeared. A moment later, he took every tape from my hands. "They're probably ruined." The next morning, the box was gone. I searched the entire garage. It had simply disappeared. By then, I'd started noticing a pattern. Whenever I accidentally got close to something from my childhood, someone quietly moved it out of my reach. Photographs, videotapes, old letters, even people. My aunt used to tell the funniest stories about me when I was little. Then one day, she stopped, completely. I asked why. She laughed. "I've already told you all the good ones." It was an obvious lie. She hadn't even paused to think. She'd answered too quickly, as if she'd practiced it before. The older I got, the more I realized my family wasn't hiding one secret. They were guarding an invisible line. Every conversation ended just before crossing it. Every story stopped one sentence too early. Every memory faded at exactly the same place. I couldn't explain it, but I started feeling like everyone in my family had read a book about my life, except me. Then my grandmother developed Alzheimer's. Everyone says Alzheimer's steals memories. Sometimes, it also steals secrets. One afternoon, I went to visit her alone. She smiled the moment she saw me. "You're late." "I know. You always were." I laughed. "I've never been late a day in my life." She shook her head. "No." Then she looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not confusion. Recognition. The kind that makes you wonder if someone is seeing the present or the past. She reached across the table and took my hand. "They've been waiting a very long time." "For what?" Her fingers tightened around mine. "For you to ask." My heart started beating faster. "Ask what?" She frowned. "They never told you." "Told me what?" She looked genuinely surprised. Then she whispered, "I thought your father would have done it by now." Before I could ask another question, the front door opened. My mother walked in carrying groceries. Grandma looked toward the hallway, then back at me. The color drained from her face. She slowly let go of my hand, and in a completely different voice said, "What a beautiful day." That was it. The conversation was over. Not because she'd forgotten, because for one brief moment, she had remembered too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every strange conversation I'd ever had with my family, every interrupted story, every missing photograph, every object that had quietly disappeared, every sentence that ended just a little too soon. For the first time in my life, I stopped trying to figure out the answer. Instead, I found myself wondering something much more terrifying. What question had my entire family been afraid of hearing? For almost 30 years, I couldn't get Grandma's words out of my head. "They've been waiting for you to ask." She hadn't sounded confused. She hadn't sounded frightened. If anything, she'd sounded relieved. For the next few weeks, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored my entire life. Once I knew what to look for, it became impossible to stop seeing it. My family didn't just avoid certain conversations. They all avoided them at exactly the same moment. It happened at my cousin Ryan's wedding. My aunt was showing old family photos on her phone when she laughed and said, "You were such a curious little kid. You kept asking the funniest." She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at my mother. My mother gave the smallest shake of her head. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I did. My aunt immediately smiled and swiped to the next picture. "Questions about dinosaurs," she finished. It sounded wrong, like she'd changed the ending halfway through. A few days later, I decided to test my theory. I invited Dad out for lunch. We talked about work, football, his retirement plans, nothing unusual. Then I casually asked, "What's the strangest question I ever asked as a kid?" He laughed. "Oh, hundreds of them." "Give me one." He thought for a second. "You wanted to know why the moon followed the car." "Another one." "You asked why dogs don't wear shoes." I smiled. "One more." His smile slowly disappeared. He stirred his coffee without looking at me. "You asked a lot of questions." "I know. So which one do you remember the most?" For several seconds he didn't answer. Then he quietly said, "I don't remember." It was the first time in my life I'd ever caught my father lying to my face. Not because he was bad at lying, because I'd asked something he'd clearly remembered too well. That night I drove home with a strange feeling in my stomach. It wasn't fear anymore, it was certainty. There really was one question everyone remembered, and nobody wanted me to hear. A week later, Mom called. "Can you come help me clean out the attic tomorrow?" She'd been meaning to organize it for years. I almost said no. Then I remembered the missing photographs, the missing videos. Maybe this time I'd finally find something they'd overlooked. Most of the attic was exactly what you'd expect. Old Christmas decorations, boxes of children's clothes, broken lamps, school projects. Near the back wall sat a dusty plastic container labeled "Important." Mom lifted the lid. Inside were birth certificates, passports, tax records, insurance papers. Nothing unusual, until I noticed another envelope underneath everything else. It had no address, no stamp, just 6 handwritten words across the front. "For the day he asks." I felt every hair on my arm stand up. "Mom!" She turned around. The moment she saw the envelope, her face changed. She walked toward me much faster than normal. "Give me that." "What is it?" "It's nothing. You wrote this." "I know." "For the day I ask what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she carefully took the envelope from my hands and held it against her chest. Exactly the way someone would protect something fragile. Or dangerous. "I shouldn't have left this up here," she whispered. I stared at her. "You've known this whole time." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "We were hoping." She stopped. "Hoping for what?" "That you'd have a happy life." "I do." "I know." "Then why can't you tell me?" She looked at me for what felt like forever. Finally, she said something that made my blood run cold. "Because once you ask it, there's no way for any of us to give you your old life back." She walked downstairs carrying the envelope, and for the first time, I didn't follow her. I stood alone in the attic, surrounded by boxes filled with memories. Real memories, edited memories, missing memories. Then I realized something that had never occurred to me before. Everyone kept saying they were waiting for me to ask. But how could I ask a question if I didn't even know what it was? I couldn't stop thinking about what Mom had said. "Once you ask it, there's no way for any of us to give you your old life back." That wasn't something you said about an embarrassing family story, or an inheritance, or an old argument. Whatever this was, it had been shaping my life without me ever realizing it. For the first time, I stopped looking for answers. Instead, I started looking for patterns. Every lie my family had ever told me had one thing in common: none of them changed who I was. They only changed what I remembered. That realization hit me harder than anything else. They weren't protecting themselves. They were protecting my memories. A week later, I drove to see Grandpa. He was 86 by then, stubborn as ever, and still insisted on mowing his own lawn even though everyone told him to stop. We sat on his back porch drinking coffee. For nearly an hour, we talked about absolutely nothing: the weather, baseball, his old truck. I almost left without mentioning any of it. Then I stood up and said, "Grandma remembered something." His hand stopped moving. "What did she say?" "She said you've all been waiting for me to ask." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out toward the yard. I was afraid she'd say that someday. "So it's true." Another long silence. Finally, he nodded. "It's true." I sat back down. "No more lies." He sighed. "I'll try." What question is everyone waiting for? He rubbed both hands across his face. I can't tell you. Why? Because it has to come from you. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. Then explain it. He looked exhausted, more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. Your father made us promise. Promise what? That none of us would ever be the first person to say it. Why? Because if we guessed wrong, what? He shook his head. I've already said too much. I leaned forward. You all act like I'm supposed to remember something. He didn't answer. I asked again. This time he quietly whispered. You were old enough. My stomach tightened. Old enough for what? He looked me straight in the eyes. To remember. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Then he stood up. Conversation over. I drove home with those 3 words echoing in my head. You were old enough. Old enough to remember? What? An accident? A fire? Someone dying? I spent the next several nights going through everything I owned from childhood. Old notebooks, school folders, birthday cards, elementary school report cards. Nothing. Then I found something strange. It was a drawing I'd made in 1st grade. At first it looked completely ordinary. A house, a tree, a blue sky, stick figures holding hands. Except, there were 5 stick figures. I grew up believing there had only ever been 4 people in our family. Mom, Dad, me, my little sister. Who was the 5th? I turned the paper over. On the back, my teacher had written in red pen, "Wonderful picture. Next time remember to write everyone's names." Below that, in childish handwriting, were 4 names. Mom, Dad, Emily, Ethan. There was space for one more. The 5th name had been erased so hard that the paper was almost torn through, not crossed out, erased, over and over, until nothing remained. I stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. Someone hadn't wanted that name to exist. That night I drove to my parents' house without calling first. Mom answered the door. The moment she saw the drawing in my hand, she closed her eyes. I wondered when you'd find that. So there was someone else. She didn't answer. Who was it? Still nothing. I held the drawing up between us. Mom. Her voice was barely audible. I can't. You can. I promised. To Dad? She nodded. I felt anger rising for the first time. Everyone keeps saying the same thing. I promised. You have to ask. We're waiting. I looked directly at her. But how am I supposed to ask the right question if nobody will even tell me what I'm missing? She began crying. Not loudly, quietly, like someone who'd been holding it in for years. Then she whispered something I'd never expected to hear. We've spent 23 years hoping you'd never notice. She looked at the drawing one last time. That someone was missing. Mom closed the front door behind us and walked into the kitchen without saying another word. She didn't ask if I wanted coffee. She didn't ask me to sit down. She just stood at the counter with both hands resting on the edge, staring out the window into the dark. I should have burned that drawing years ago, she whispered. So there really was someone. She nodded. I can't tell you who. Why? Because that's not the question. I frowned. What does that even mean? She turned toward me, her eyes red from crying. You're looking in the wrong direction. I felt my patience slipping. For 23 years, everyone in this family has been speaking in riddles. I know. I'm tired of riddles. So am I. For a moment, I almost believed she was finally going to tell me everything. Instead, she quietly said, If I answer the wrong question, I'll take something away from you that you can never get back. I laughed bitterly. I think you've already done that. She didn't argue. That hurt even more. I left without another word. The next morning, my phone rang. It was my aunt. I heard you were at your parents' house. Mom called you? No. Then how do you know? There was a pause. She didn't have to. That answer bothered me more than it should have. It meant everyone was still watching, still waiting, still talking to each other every time I got too close. I met my aunt that afternoon at a small cafe she'd always loved. She looked nervous before I even sat down. I know why you're here. Then save us both some time. She smiled sadly. I wish I could. I slid the drawing across the table. There were 5 people. She looked at it for several seconds, then pushed it back toward me. Maybe. I won't confirm it. You already did. She sighed. I suppose I did. I leaned forward. Was it a brother? No. A sister? No. A relative? Silence. A friend? Nothing. Someone who died? Her eyes instantly filled with tears. Not because I'd guessed correctly, because I'd finally asked something that frightened her. She reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Stop. Tell me I'm wrong. I can't. So I'm right. I didn't say that. But you didn't deny it. She let go of my hand. Then, after looking around to make sure nobody was listening, she said something so quietly I almost missed it. The day you remember. You'll understand why none of us could answer. Remember. There it was again. Not discover, not learn. Remember. Everyone kept using that same word. I drove home repeating it over and over in my head. Remember. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I walked into the spare bedroom where my parents had stored a few boxes of my childhood things after I'd moved out. I wasn't looking for photographs anymore. I wasn't looking for names. I was looking for anything that suggested I'd forgotten part of my own life. Near the bottom of an old school box, I found a folder labeled First Grade. Inside were spelling tests, math worksheets, and drawings. Then I found a short assignment titled, The Scariest Day I Can Remember. My hands immediately started shaking. I unfolded the paper. Every line had been covered with thick black marker, not by a child, by an adult. Someone had gone over every single sentence until nothing underneath could be read. Only the title remained. I turned the page over. On the back, my teacher had written, "Thank you for coming in today. I understand why Ethan isn't ready to talk about this at school. Please let me know if he needs more time." I read it 3 times. More time. To talk about what? I grabbed my phone and searched for the name of my first grade teacher. To my surprise, she was still teaching at the same elementary school. The next morning, I drove there before classes started. I wasn't even sure what I was going to say. When I introduced myself, she looked confused for only a second. Then her expression changed. She recognized my name immediately. Not my face, my name. "Oh," she whispered. "I always wondered if you'd come back someday." My heart started racing. "You remember me?" She gave a slow nod. "I remember every child." I placed the blacked-out assignment on her desk. "Can you tell me why my parents didn't want me talking about this?" She looked down at the paper, then back at me. For several long seconds, she said absolutely nothing. Finally, she asked a question that made every strange moment of the last 23 years suddenly feel connected. She looked me in the eyes and quietly said, "Ethan, has nobody ever told you why you stopped asking about that day?" She didn't say anything else. Neither did I. The hallway outside her classroom slowly filled with children, teachers carrying coffee, parents saying goodbye. It felt like the whole world kept moving while mine had completely stopped. Finally, I managed to speak. "What day?" She looked genuinely confused. "The day you wrote about." "I don't remember writing it." Her eyebrows slowly drew together. "You don't?" I shook my head. "I don't remember any of it." For the first time since I'd arrived, she looked frightened. Not for herself, for me. She opened the folder again and gently ran her fingers over the thick black marker covering every line. "I wasn't the one who blacked this out. I figured. Your parents picked you up early that afternoon." She paused. "They were both crying." I felt my chest tighten. "They asked me for a favor." "What favor?" "They said if you ever came back, I wasn't supposed to tell you what happened." I laughed quietly. "Of course they did. But they also said something else." "What?" She looked directly into my eyes. "They told me if you came back, it meant you were finally ready." Ready. Another word I'd heard over and over. Waiting. Promise. Remember. Ready. Every conversation seemed to use the same handful of words, almost like everyone had rehearsed them. "Can you at least tell me one thing?" I asked. She hesitated. "Did someone die?" She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she nodded. It wasn't a dramatic reaction, just one slow movement. "Yes, someone had died." I felt sick. "Who?" "I'm sorry. Please. I can't answer that." "Why not?" "Because that's not the question." I stood there staring at her. Everyone kept saying exactly the same thing, almost word for word, as if they'd made the same promise together. I thanked her for her time and walked back to my car. I didn't start the engine. Instead, I sat there for almost an hour. Someone had died. I had been there. I had written about it. Then I'd somehow forgotten. Or someone had helped me forget. That thought terrified me more than anything else. Not because memories fade, because memories don't disappear from every person at the same time. People make them disappear. When I got home, I did something I'd never done before. I requested every record I could find from my childhood. School records, medical records, hospital visits, anything. Most of it arrived over the next few days. Routine checkups, vaccinations, report cards. Then I noticed something strange. There was a gap. Almost 6 months. No school records. No medical appointments. Nothing. As if that period of my life simply didn't exist. I called Mom. "I'm looking at my records." Silence. I found the gap. More silence. Finally she whispered, I hoped you never would. What happened during those 6 months? I can't tell you. You keep saying that. I know. I'm done listening. She began crying before I finished the sentence. I don't care what promise you made. Ethan, no. I'm asking you as your son. She didn't answer. I'm asking because I deserve to know. Nothing. Then I asked the simplest question I'd asked anyone in weeks. Was I there? The crying stopped instantly, completely. For several seconds I thought the call had disconnected. Then I heard her breathing, very quietly. Mom. Another long pause. Finally, yes. My heart pounded. There, where? She covered the phone for a second. I could hear Dad's voice in the background. Then she came back. Her voice was barely audible. You were there. I know that. You saw everything. Every muscle in my body went rigid. Everything. Not something. Everything. What did I see? She broke down completely. Real sobbing this time. I'm so sorry. What did I see? I'm sorry. What happened? I can't. Then I heard Dad take the phone. Ethan. His voice sounded older than I'd ever heard it. I need you to listen carefully. I'm listening. If you ask me the wrong question, I'll answer it. I frowned. What? But if you ask the right one. He stopped speaking. What happens? You won't need my answer. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, trying to understand what he'd meant. Then something hit me. For weeks I'd been asking the same kinds of questions. Who died? What happened? Where was I? Maybe those weren't the questions they'd been afraid of. Maybe there was only one question that mattered. One question nobody in my family had ever been willing to say out loud. And for the first time, I thought I knew what it was. For the next 3 days, I didn't call anyone. Not my parents. Not my aunt. Not Grandpa. For the first time in weeks, I stopped chasing clues. Instead, I sat alone with one thought. They were never afraid of giving me the answer. They were afraid of hearing the question. I replayed every conversation in my head. Every single one. Whenever I asked what happened, they stayed silent. Whenever I asked who died, they cried. Whenever I asked where was I, they looked away. But none of those questions ever broke them. There was only one thing every single person had repeated. You'll remember. Not, you'll understand. Not, you'll find out. You'll remember. Late on the third night, I pulled the first grade drawing back out of the folder. 5 stick figures. 4 names. 1 erased. I stared at it for almost an hour. Then I noticed something I'd somehow missed. The erased name wasn't written at the end. It had been written between mine and my sister's. As if whoever that person was, they belonged between us. I closed my eyes. Something felt wrong. Not in the drawing. Inside me. A feeling I couldn't explain. Like standing in a room you visited before but can't remember when. Then another memory surfaced. Not a clear memory. Just a sound. Someone laughing. Children running. The smell of popcorn. Bright sunlight. Then, sirens. My heart started racing. I stood up so fast my chair fell backward. I didn't know why. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to my parents' house. It was after midnight. Dad opened the door before I even knocked, almost as if he'd been awake waiting. He looked at me for a long time, then quietly stepped aside. I knew this day would come. Neither of us sat down. Neither of us spoke. Finally, I looked him in the eyes. I don't want another clue. He nodded. I know. I don't want another promise. He nodded again. I know. I took a deep breath. Then I asked the only question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Who have I been trying to remember? My entire life. Dad closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his face. When he opened them again, he didn't answer. He simply walked to the hallway closet, reached onto the top shelf, and pulled down a dusty cardboard box. He carried it into the living room and placed it on the coffee table. For several seconds he just stared at it. Then he lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, home videos, birthday cards, school drawings, everything my family had hidden for more than 20 years, every missing memory, every missing photograph, every missing piece of my childhood. Right on top was a picture of 2 little boys sitting on a swing. One of them was me. The other looked almost exactly like me. Same dark hair, same smile, same eyes. He couldn't have been more than 7. I picked up the photograph with shaking hands. Who's this? Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. His name was Jacob. The room became completely silent. I stared at the photograph. I knew that face. Not because I'd seen the picture before, because somewhere deep inside me, I'd never forgotten it. Dad sat down. He was your older brother. Everything inside me stopped. Don't have a brother. You did. The words hit harder than anything I'd ever heard. Dad looked toward the window. When you were 5, the two of you were playing at the county fair. The smell of popcorn, the sunlight, children laughing, the memories came back in scattered flashes. He let go of your hand for a few seconds, Dad continued. You ran after a balloon that had blown across the parking lot. Jacob ran after you. My breathing became uneven. He reached you. Dad's voice cracked. He pushed you out of the way. The sirens. Someone screaming. A loud horn. Everything exploded inside my head. For the first time in 23 years, I remembered. Jacob had smiled at me just before he shoved me. Then, the truck. I dropped the photograph. No. I could hear my own voice shaking. No. Dad was crying openly now. You kept asking us the same question after the funeral. He paused. You asked it every day. I couldn't breathe. Mom quietly walked into the room. She'd been standing outside the entire time. She knelt beside me. Her hands were trembling just as much as mine. You were only 5, she whispered. You couldn't understand. I looked at her through tears. What did I keep asking? She buried her face in her hands. Dad answered for her. You kept asking. He struggled to get the words out. Why did Jacob save me instead of himself? Silence filled the room. No one spoke, because there had never been an answer. That was the question my family had spent 23 years protecting me from asking again. Not because they were hiding the truth, but because no parent could ever answer it. Jacob hadn't chosen to die. He had chosen, in one impossible second, to save his little brother. There was never a reason that could make that fair. I looked back at the photograph one last time. Then I finally understood something my father had been trying to tell me all along. If I'd asked the right question, I would never have needed anyone to answer it. Because the moment I remembered Jacob's face, I already knew.